Thank you all again for coming today. My name is Kelley Bemis. I work for the Cook County Department of Public Health. I do data analytics for all of communicable disease, which for the past 3 years has meant COVID all the time, and I'm sure everyone in the room can relate to that. I'm very excited to be moderating this panel today on wastewater. COVID-19 was the first time I'd ever worked with wastewater in a public health capacity, and it's been a lot to learn, especially as a public health person. I think there's been a lot of chatter about public health practitioners having to learn how to interpret this data. And I'm particularly excited to be here moderating this panel today to learn from all of our great scientists and practitioners that we have. And thanks in advance for everything I know I'm going to learn over the next half hour, 45 minutes. So I'll let them go down the line and introduce themselves.
Hi, my name is Barrie Bodie. I am the Director of COVID-19 Facilities at NIU. I'm also a professor of biological sciences, and my background is actually cancer research. It's not infectious disease. So with that, I will turn it over to my colleague next to me.
Hello everyone, my name is Kartikeye Kekre. I'm a R&D scientist at Shield T3. I work with product development, data interfacing, data modeling. My specialty is wastewater treatment, but now I'm doing COVID stuff.
Awesome. Hello everyone, I'm Charles Williams. I'm Chief of Testing at the Illinois Department of Public Health, and I'm just so glad to see everyone in person. I'll pass it to you.
Hi, Jared Schuetter with Battelle. I'm a data scientist, and Battelle, if you haven't heard of it, we're a large independent nonprofit research institute headquartered in Columbus, Ohio.
Hi everyone, I'm Rachel Poretsky. I'm an associate professor at UIC, and my background is in microbial ecology. I worked a lot in wastewater prior to COVID, looking at things like antimicrobial resistance and community composition of bacteria and viruses, but now I'm the lab lead of the wastewater surveillance program that goes on statewide in Illinois, and then we have another project that's Chicago specific. So we're doing wastewater, mostly COVID, but we're evolving.
Great, thanks everybody. So I kind of want to start off really broad here and let you guys all kind of choose where you want to take this question. I think it's safe to say that the pandemic has really launched wastewater surveillance into kind of broader awareness in the public. Actually, somebody just linked me an article about wastewater surveillance from the Scientific American this morning. So it's out there. People, maybe they don't understand this term, but they hear this term now. What do you think are some of the most important lessons learned from the pandemic? And then how do you think the field can or should evolve at this point?
Okay, so since I'm most proximal, yeah. So there were a few questions in there. I think, so one of the things we've learned from the pandemic is that we can definitely monitor ambient levels of, in this case, SARS-CoV-2 in the community. And we can do so in a way that has some predictive value to it. We've seen levels go up in the community before we saw the number of cases rise, especially during the first 2 surges. So there is predictive value that's probably been known for a while, but that was news to me. And I think the second part of the question was involved, where do you see it going from here? And I think now that COVID-19 is kind of like reached the status that it has, I think we're looking to other pathogens in the wastewater, which has been used in the past for monitoring other pathogens. But I think the fact that wastewater surveillance has become, kind of shined a spotlight on over the last couple of years, I think now maybe the support for leveraging that tool will perhaps go up. So, yeah.
I'll jump in. Wow. So, a couple things. At the State Health Department, IDPH, we launched our statewide program in collaboration with the Discovery Partners Institute back in May 2021. And since the initiation, we've grown to 78 collection sites, approximately I think we're at 78 collection sites across about 47 counties. And so for us, and learning from kind of our experience with SHIELD, all the SHIELD sweating that we did, when we were seeing, we went from, schools and sites not wanting to do any testing to what they called saliva-geddon. We learned a lot about logistics. We learned a lot about human behavior. And I think a lot of those lessons from that, including the fact that schools didn't really want to test at first, right? So that, I think, translating that to our experience with wastewater gave us a least invasive approach, right? To being able to understand. I think it was President Kelley say, we have to know that the disease is there, right? But how do we do that knowing that humans don't want to do anything? We want to know, but we don't want to do anything to know. So wastewater at the state level provided a least invasive way to understand the presence of disease. So least invasive, low cost, we're talking cents compared to, Ron and the SHIELD team, the SHIELD team was amazing at getting the cost of testing down, probably doing it better than any other program around the country, really. We got it down to $15 a test for a PCR test, which is like phenomenal. But it still pales in comparison when you're talking understanding the disease prevalence in a population for less than a penny per capita, right? So it's really cost effective, so least invasive, cost effective. And I think that a third piece that we learned when SHIELD was, had to call in favors, I heard him mention to get, things through customs because in supply chain challenges, the least amount of resources needed. And I think that, wastewater surveillance really provides that as well, because we can use a small amount of resources to capture the transmission patterns of a large population. And I'm going to stop there because I don't want to hog, but where it's going, maybe we can come back to that because I got some thoughts.
Yeah, I'll just piggyback on that because it was not trivial to start these programs. And even for places like, if you look at something like BioBot that existed before COVID to do wastewater surveillance, even they had to ramp up and develop methods. Barrie and I are part of this Slack group that has thousands of people in it. Early in 2020, we were on calls with people across the country and across the world, in fact, trying to come up with methods, troubleshoot. I'm seeing this, what are you seeing? I get these weird results. Does this make sense to you? How are you treating your wastewater? And so it was a lot of learning the how to get this started, and it was a lot of investment in infrastructure and personnel, and from IDPH's perspective, CDPH, CDC, all these agencies that funneled money into developing these programs with the intention that we were doing this at the moment for COVID, for SARS-CoV-2, but to put all these resources into developing something, it doesn't make sense to do it for one thing when wastewater has everything in it already. If there's polio in the wastewater already, whether we look for it or not. And so we had we built this up with the intention that it could be applied to different pathogens, that it could be applied to future public health concerns by investing in all these, learning the technical side and getting all the infrastructure up and running. And I think we're in a really excellent place now, both here in Illinois and across the world.
Jared, was your experience in Ohio any different?
Yeah, well, I will say one of the main lessons learned, I guess, is that you can really get people to talk about wastewater surveillance, because if you interject the word poop into any conversation, their ears perk up immediately. But the thing that comes to my mind also is, recently the CDC commissioned the National Academies to do a study into wastewater, and they put out a report this year. It's like 120 pages long, talking about all kinds of things with wastewater surveillance. And a lot of the things that they say in their summary statement, I think resonated a lot with things that I've seen in Ohio and talked about here. First of all, they declare that yes, wastewater surveillance does have value, just like Barrie was talking about earlier. But in order for it to really make an impact, the big message is we need to be intentional about where we take it. So we need to standardize the way that samples are collected and analyzed. We need to, as we expand from SARS-CoV-2 to other pathogens, we need to be intentional about how we choose which pathogens to target, maybe in terms of cost-benefit analysis, in terms of how easy they are to measure. The third piece was more about communication, especially when talking to the public about issues of privacy, because there are privacy concerns about analysis of the human genomic data that's in the wastewater. And then finally, in order to really make a dent in the problem, the government needs to collaborate with both academia and industry. And to make that happen, there really needs to be sustained and reliable funding streams available. Otherwise, things aren't going to progress to the point they need to get to. So that's where it should go, I guess.
A couple of things I learned on the job while getting into this was how we present the data. So I interface with a lot of clients, show them data, and coming freshly from academia, I would start on trend lines, regression lines, shedding rates, and usually people on these calls are administration, facilities people, and they would just turn off, and usually their answer would be, okay, so what do we do with this? And it was an experience to learn, kind of show data in their language, tell them, this is an alert, this is not an alert, but you need to monitor, and kind of keep them serious about the situation rather than them pulling back and not taking it seriously. And the other thing is kind of developing these partnerships with different aspects. We could run the wastewater samples, we could develop data out of it, but as long as the sampling spaces where it should be sampled from, which is the best manhole to open in order to get that sample, all of that is not kind of done in a very, in a teamwork situation. It can be very difficult getting a proper sample.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of a perfect jumping off point into the next question I wanted to pose to you guys, which is, I think everybody's answers kind of touched on how quickly this got off the ground, which is impressive in its own right, but I think even more so impressive when you consider the number of different entities that have to work together to do wastewater surveillance. I mean, that was something that was new for me on the public health side. Usually our primary people that we're working with are healthcare providers, but in this case, you're talking about, you have public health, you have the wastewater treatment plant staff and operators, you've got the labs that are actually doing the testings, potentially contractors kind of connecting all of those pieces together. So what do you guys feel like were some of your successes and challenges in bringing all of these different people together to work well together? Charles, we'll start in the middle this time.
Go ahead.
Well, I'll start by saying that the first hurdle for us at the state was really getting the buy-in from our state health director and the governor. And I do have to say that when you talk about poop, it does change the tone of things. And I'll never forget our state director during COVID was Dr. Ezike, and we'd start our meetings and we'd talk about the agenda, and she'd say, so Charles, are we going to talk about poop water now? And I'm like, yes, we are. And but getting that buy-in internally was first, and the data was critical with that. I was talking to Lisa Colley this morning about Arizona, and there was this early data that really showed and you may remember it too, Rachel, but there was an early data that showed like the really like a sigmoidal curve that showed, where the detection in wastewater was a prelude to the clinical detection, and that was huge. Having that data was huge. So data is critical with being able to bring people together. Poop discussion too. And then as far as externally, I think one of the things that we heard in launching this, when we started to engage the treatment plants, we heard that there was some semblances of a program out there, but you remember what they said, that they were like, we don't know what like we provide samples and we don't know what happens to we got no findings back. And so I think that was definitely a lesson learned, and a critical piece for working with multiple partners is transparency, really. Being able to say, okay, this is the role that you'll play. Here's how it feeds into the larger initiative that's going on. And by the way, here's how this looks in terms of relevant data that's actionable and useful for you. So delivering that back, I think, was really key.
So I can tell you a little bit about, the partnerships that we forged to stand up the wastewater program. So about the time that, Ron and Andrew and I were talking about shield testing on the NIU campus, I was approached by our water reclamation district. And they asked if we would be interested in setting up a wastewater surveillance lab. I said, sure, let's do it. And so again, we had the qPCR units in my lab from cancer research. So we leveraged the equipment that was already there. But the partnership was with our wastewater district, and they brought us samples for the first year from 3 separate sites. So that's what we were testing around the DeKalb area. This year we expanded to 7 sites on campus outside of each residence hall, so we got a little more granularity. And we're seeing some interesting patterns right now, but that's how the partnership started. And we had a lot of support by our administration. Our president is a veterinarian with a background in epidemiology, and she was very interested in making sure that we leverage this tool, any tool, during the pandemic that might be able to help us. And so now that's how the partnership started. I think one of the challenges ahead is how do you leverage the data that we're finding and what we're seeing at the wastewater level and operationalize that at the public health level. I think that's the big question that's out there right now. We see patterns. We can tell you just in very generic terms when levels are high across campus. Right now we're seeing levels high in 1 or 2 residence halls and nowhere else. So, we're right after spring break, right? So that made sense. But how do you, during a public health challenge, translate what we can measure in wastewater and bring that to the public health professionals that can help implement plans or provide information that will mitigate the impact on the communities that we're surveying? And the one other thing I'll add is that wastewater surveillance it's passive and it's unbiased. Unless you don't want to use the public sewage system, it's going to be there. You're a contributor, and one of our jokes is when we talk about our wastewater program is we'd like to thank all of our anonymous donors.
Yes.
So.
That's great. I like that. I'll just add too that one of the things that I love about this work is how many different partners there are. Charles talked about like the industry, the wastewater facility partners, and Barrie mentioned the public health partners. Charles is a public health, and Kelley are public health partners. We are communicating with people from disparate fields. I'm working with clinicians and public health practitioners and researchers, microbiologists. And one of the tricky things is that we all have slightly different vocabulary for things. So when we think about sensitivity, we're talking about, is it sensitivity meaning how many cases in a population are we able to see, or is it sensitivity how many pieces of nucleic acid in a wastewater are we able to detect? There's lots of challenges in our how we communicate, but I think that's one of the real pleasures of this is figuring out how to communicate and like Barrie said, share our data in a way that makes sense and can be interpreted by our anonymous donors and our practitioners alike.
I guess from my perspective, so Batel's been helping analyze wastewater samples in Ohio through the Ohio Coronavirus Wastewater Monitoring Network. So it's a partnership with Ohio Department of Health and Ohio State University. We've been kind of pushing beyond PCR into, targeted hybridization, whole genome sequencing, those sorts of things. But what's been really helpful, I guess, with that partnership, and it's really, I guess, no surprise, but it is still worth mentioning, these things always are helped when there's like almost a hub with spokes or something to the organization. There needs to be someone in the middle who's kind of got their eye on the ball, on the big picture, and making sure that they know everything that's going on and they have the direction figured out helps. So the Ohio Department of Health kind of played that role. But also you need trust with all the partners and some slack in the rope, I guess, to help them, let them go off and explore things together. And so that's what's been really great about the partnership is while they're trying to stand up this network throughout all of Ohio, analyzing wastewater, primarily focused on qPCR for COVID, we're also able to do this research to try to push the boundaries of what can you see in wastewater, what other types of pathogens, or other sorts of things like exposure, contaminants, things like that, can we find in the wastewater? So that's been helpful.
I think one of the things I learned here is that when there is a good amount of trust and work with partners for a longer period of time, you can expand on what kind of research you can do. For example, one of our partners, University of Illinois, we were able to expand beyond COVID testing, monkeypox and other diseases as well. So in order to foster future research, it's important to keep connected with all these people. That's one of the more important things.
I think that's a great point, Kartikeye, and I'm going to go right back to you for this one because my last question I'm hoping we have time for everybody to speak on here was the one that's nearest and dearest to my heart, which has to do with how do we communicate this data to stakeholders. So you had mentioned being on calls with some of your leadership. We're like, what is a regression? What is a spline? What does this mean? I know one of my philosophies when we're building dashboards, when we're creating reports is if we're making decisions on a piece of data, I want the public to be able to see that data. But wastewater is extremely complex. It's certainly the most complex data source I've ever worked with. So I was wondering if you all could speak on kind of some of the successes and challenges you've had with trying to communicate this data to your stakeholders, whether that's students on campus or leadership or just members of the public.
I think one of the things that happens is at the moment they know it's wastewater-based data, there's a certain amount of casualness to it. They think it's not actionable, it's not a good proof. But when they see that peak and then suddenly there's an outbreak, everyone suddenly understands that that data is important. And we have that instance happen so many times with our clients that every time there is now a peak in wastewater viral loads, there's an immediate email or a phone call where, okay, what do we do now? Do we send a campus-wide email, or is it a masking requirement? And so basically from that interaction, we develop models where we tell them, okay, this is just, you need to monitor what is the level of alert, and who might be responsible for this viral load. So all of that is kind of important when developing a strategy to communicate with people. It's also good to know who you're talking to, because if it's public health people, they would definitely enjoy the data aspect of it. But if it's the administration, they just want to know if it's a problem. And they do, the moment they hear regression, you can see their eyes roll back. and they are not interested anymore. It's good to know beforehand who you're talking to and make sure that you have dialogues ready for each kind of personality.
So I can speak. You had mentioned about dashboards, and so we've had a dashboard at NIU for the last couple of years, and we've changed it a few times based on how we felt it was conveying the intended message to people who looked at it. And recently, what we went to was so it was very technical when we first did it. So many genomic copies per. What does that mean, right? So we've since installed on our dashboard meters that green, yellow, red. Is it low? Is it moderate? Is it high? And each one of those colors has a bar with a legend that has some brief information. Levels are currently high at this site. We recommend taking extra precautions, et cetera. Or it's green, simply no change in current protocol. So I think that's about as simple as you can do. And because I was getting calls from the residence hall director like, okay, what does this mean? What does this mean? What do we do with this? And so I do think it's very important to understand who you're conveying to. And so we have had some experience with that, and that's how we kind of handled that. So,
Simplicity, red, yellow, greens. I love it. I think those, I definitely, there have been times where I'm like, we just need it more simple. And and so I know when we communicate to the public, it has to be super simple. I think kind of a layer from what Barrie was talking, one of the things that we've initiated is a couple things as well. First of all, with the kind of red, yellow, green, high, medium, low, we've incorporated kind of a historical look at how, when we, within that red is encompassed a historical look of like the 4-week trend within that. And then I think that also we've added, similarly, a projected risk of what's to come. And we've kind of rolled that into that single metric so that, it really gets at, a more comprehensive look. So when you see that red, yellow, green, or when you see that green, within that, kind of the gradation of a green a little more. And so from a transmission standpoint or presence standpoint, I think that's been helpful. At the end of the day, it's just red, yellow, green to some stakeholders, but for others who, like Kelley Bemis, who needs a more, she wants to know more about it, that's all encompassed in there. And so I think the team has done an awesome job with that. They've got some smart folks over there with the data. And then I'd say, besides that, regular communication is key. That's another thing, and I love the dashboard. I'll echo that. Being able to have multiple metrics, so not only looking at transmission, but then you can look at, in a snapshot, you can look at the pervasiveness of certain variants. That's huge, and then you can look at hospitalizations. Having all that together for public health decision making is really helpful. And I'd say, so when we talk about dashboards that, like when we're looking at it from public health practitioners, I think having all that right there so that you can triangulate and think about how other things play off of each other is key as well. And the relative abundance, I hope you might mention that too, because when we talk about the variance, the team they came up with basically a metric of how much we see XBB, but how much XBB is actually there at a site, so that type of thing.
Yeah, Charles said a lot of what I was going to say, but
Sorry.
that's okay. No, that's
We're on
great.
the same team, so.
Perfect. No, it's great. I do want to echo that we have a phenomenal team, but probably similar to what you're doing in Ohio, we have a phenomenal data scientist, and a lot of what we've been doing has evolved over the last couple of years. So we've brought in, we didn't start where we are now. We've brought in this single metric that we now have. We've brought in the variant analysis plots that look different now than they did in the beginning. CDC posts all the data, so we send it directly to CDC and they post it on the national dashboard. So there's multiple places that people can go and see, and you can see the Midwest is very well represented between Ohio and Illinois, Missouri. And so there's lots of venues, and then we, like Charles said, we have different levels of reports that go to different people. So we send monthly reports to the utilities, to the wastewater treatment plants, so that they know what's happening with all the poop that they send us. They're doing this on a voluntary basis. We have also a phenomenal partner who works with community engagement, works with engaging our treatment plants and communicating with them, keeping them in the loop. So we have a report that goes to them. We have the report that goes to the public health. We have the public-facing data. And yeah. Yep.
Yeah, so I haven't had to do much communication with the public, but the people I have had to do communication with is the management in my company to try to get them to let us do wastewater work, right? The problem, of course, is that we only have limited resources to try to build capabilities. Battelle works in tons of areas, from health to the environment to national security. So when you have limited resources, we kind of need to put them toward the places where our capabilities are going to do the greatest good, but also where there's going to be sustainable funding over time so that we can continue to win work in that area. All of our money comes from contract work. So, a lot of it was good that wastewater surveillance took off during the pandemic. I think it holds a lot of promise, but also because everybody was scrambling to do stuff with limited resources and doing it their own way, there's not like a clear and cohesive strategy, which means there isn't any sort of funding stream that we can depend on. So, I do think that as this vision gets pushed forward, as we start to standardize things and make more funding available, then companies like Battelle and others in industry are going to feel more comfortable about making larger investments. And then you'll get a whole bunch of new innovation from those sources.
Well, speaking of new innovation, we've got just a few minutes left before we can turn it over to questions. So I'm gonna surprise you guys with one unplanned question. And we can maybe start with Rachel and go down. How about just one or two sentences on the question you're most excited to tackle next? What's the research area that has you really jazzed?
Well, so I've always been really excited about antimicrobial resistance, but I think more broadly than that, I'm really driven by using wastewater, what the potential for wastewater is. And I think as we've developed this for various targets and evolved, Mpox, and then we develop an Mpox assay, and polio, and we develop a polio assay, that at some point this becomes less sustainable. You don't want to be responsive, you want to be proactive. And so I'm really excited about things that we're doing in the lab to try to do less biased surveillance, look at everything that's there, including things like antimicrobial resistance and other targets, but things that we don't know about beforehand.
Jared?
Yep. So, what I think is intriguing about wastewater surveillance is that, you're getting this unbiased sampling of a large community and the environment within that community. And so, depending on all the different things that you try to target in wastewater, you can really build this broad foundation of data that touches on all facets of human life. And so I'm interested to see when you take that broad pool of data from wastewater surveillance and you start pairing it or fusing it with other data sources, what sorts of things can you do then, right? What sorts of forecasting can you now do? What kind of risk profiling can you now do and have more confidence and accuracy in those models, because the wastewater surveillance data is there, kind of providing an orthogonal data source to all of those others. So as a data scientist, that's what I'm interested in. Yeah.
I'm so thankful for the data scientists to work with, because it really, I mean, so what I'm most excited about, I really want Illinois to have the most robust surveillance system in the nation, and wastewater is a part of that. I'm really excited because of, well, I'm hopeful and excited that the development of assays will be faster. That's one thing, and then I'm really excited to move, to become more sensitive. So for instance, we know that lots of times when we experience an emergence of a pathogen in the US, we've already seen some semblance of it internationally, overseas, right? And so I think that we really need to go, how do we take what's going on overseas that happened 3 weeks ago and set up a system where we monitor it for it, you know, and can really detect it before it becomes something, you know, outrageous here. Monkeypox, we had to, you know, unfortunately, you know, from our clinical testing response, you know, we had to be very rapid, pointed, and targeted with our mpox response, right? But wow, if we could have known this is going to develop here, because our sentinel sites around our state, we've got, you know, so we've got a flag going off over here. Let's start targeting this now. You know, that's where I'm really excited to go, where we have these really robust, durable systems that can hopefully at a low cost have many pathogens that make sense that we're monitoring for.
I think you'll call me biased, but I think one of the most key innovations that are required would be how we pre-process the sample, removing inhibitors from wastewater, because we can sample anywhere, but the randomness of wastewater and how some places would have higher metal concentrations, some places would have some other things, and it's important to kind of have a standardized pre-processing step or an adaptable pre-processing step so that these inhibitors can be removed and the data that is generated is more reliable in that sense.
So one of the things I'm most excited about is I've learned a lot about wastewater, but what I view it as is exactly as this conference is intending. I view it as a forum to train students in integrative and transdisciplinary academic programs, and so I'm very excited at that prospect, and we are having active discussions on how to leverage our current wastewater lab into doing that. Ron talked a little bit about how SHIELD is repurposing their lab, their testing lab in Chicago, to help train the next generation of technicians, which we desperately need, and we'd like to do the same type of thing with ours. So that's what I'm most excited about. Now, what I'll finish with is, generally, what I saw as a silver lining to this whole pandemic is that I noticed, particularly in the scientific community, people became more collaborative, more open, and I really hope that we can leverage and sustain that momentum moving forward, because I think we can do some really cool stuff with this. So.
Yeah, hear, hear. I think that's a perfect note to end on. So thank you again to all of our panelists. How about a round of applause for them?
We're going to
Got about
go ahead and open it
5
for
minutes for
questions. Yeah. I was getting texts that people had questions.
Hi, my name is Natalie Lubbers. I'm the Director of Lab Operations for SHIELD Illinois, and I wanted to say just great job on the work that you're doing and the innovation that you guys have started, and I see a lot of possibilities. But I wondered if you could speak a little bit more about the residence halls and kind of what action plans you put in place to kind of mitigate and yeah.
Sure, that's coming to me, right, Natalie? So yeah, what our follow-on plan was, we were able to procure a bunch of rapid tests, and we gave them to the residence hall director, and he then distributed them to the 7 residence hall directors. And when we hit those red zones where there's, where COVID's very prevalent, students receive an automated email that if they're not feeling well, they should test, and that they can go see their residence hall director for a rapid test.
Compliance-wise, and especially when you're getting granular with the wastewater and transparency-wise and communication with the community, have you guys had a lot of pushback yet on doing wastewater testing and targeting a granular segment of the population?
We have not. No, surprisingly, we haven't. Where we did get pushback is Syed and I did a STEM cafe a couple months ago. That's where we go out into like a local bar or restaurant and then talk about something. We were told that wastewater testing was too gross for the Two Brothers Roundhouse out here in Chicago. So we instead did it at the fine establishment called Fatty's, which is the sports bar at NIU. So anyway, that's the most pushback that we've gotten so far. So.
We do pretty granular work too. Our state project is at wastewater treatment plants, but here in Chicago, we monitor the Cook County Jail, among other locations, and we get specific divisions within the jail, and we work really closely with the clinicians there who really value the data. I think knowing what's happening at that, we can't pinpoint an individual. We're not, in a neighborhood where we're getting to a individual's house or even street, but knowing in these congregate living facilities like dorms and whether they're student dorms or detainee dorms, it's really useful because that's where a lot of disease transmission happens and where it can get bad.
And then Charles, you guys have the pilot in schools now too, right? Elementary and middle school. Have you had any pushback from the community there?
Pushback, but not the type of pushback like we don't want wastewater. We don't want I'd say, and not somebody's in the, so the challenge that we've experienced with our school pilot, because quite honestly, when it comes to K through 12 schools, I question the utility of wastewater surveillance, because I'm like, I don't know, just personally, I never wanted to poop at school when I was a kid. I was like, I don't want to go in the bathroom. I'm like, I don't want to go in the bathroom, let alone like, touching it. So I just didn't, I'm like, I wouldn't be a contributor really, so
Apparently that's true for middle school and up, and there is published data on this. Elementary school kids will poop at school. Middle school and up do not.
I remember being in preschool and like being disgusted, literally.
And Charles.
So
elementary school or middle school and up, and Charles
middle
will
school,
not poop at school.
But so we can question the utility. We've done a pilot project to really understand it, and so we wanted to partner that. So Shield. We really identified schools that were testing because we want to understand what are you seeing clinically, what are we seeing in the wastewater, is there effect on absenteeism and et cetera. So the challenge is that Natsumi's who's been engaging these schools and collecting the data and working with their school nurses. Unfortunately, the feedback that we get about how many children were out that week? Was it because of a respiratory illness? That type of thing. So the pushback isn't so much of like they're okay with participating, like 20 schools, but it's that I won't say it's pushback even, but it's just kind of like, you know, people are stretched, they don't get, so that's really what we've encountered most. It hasn't been like a rejection of the method because again, if it's least invasive and they don't have to do anything, they're usually, we finding that people are okay with it.
I think we're going to do one more question, and then, oh.
Hi, my name is Ujjal. So I really like the idea of wastewater surveillance because it's kind of an advanced signal of some potential health crisis that might emerge in some cases, right? So what I want to ask is, obviously you're starting with this, that let's say you detect a high risk in certain zone, and that's basically for the whole community. There needs to be a whole machinery beyond that to actually focus and trace and track. So for that to get completed, like how do you complete the loop there, right? It needs to be supported by a whole machinery of focused, targeted surveillance. Otherwise, it's not going to be controlling anything, right? So my question is, like, you find in a zip code or near a school that there is high risk of something, some pathogen, right? What do you do after that? How do you really focus after that to control that pathogen, because it's the whole school, right? You don't know who it is, right? So that machinery needs to get developed, isn't it?
It depends. Oh,
Go ahead, please, no. Go ahead.
It depends on what you're looking for and what the target is. There's going to be different responses for different pathogens or different targets. But I think your point is spot on, that measuring it is only gets you so far, that you need an actionable plan. And that's what we work closely with our public health partners on thinking about, is what do we do with these data? So depending on what the target is, maybe you don't need to get the individual. You know, we're not looking to like treat a sick person. We're looking to understand trends. Are things getting higher in a community, and is this looking worrisome? And now do we have to push vaccination? Polio is a great example. Like, the one mitigation that you can do is push vaccination. That's the only thing you can do, is push vaccination. And so depending on what it is, you have to have a strategy to communicate. You don't need to know who in the community is sick or is potentially spreading it, but what are your responses going to be? Vaccination, testing, like Barrie said, or something else?
I would think that before vaccination, there is communication that can happen. You can let the community know that this is something which you need to be aware of.
Right, but there's a trade-off. So there's this idea of the worried well. Like, you don't want to get well people panicked because you're like, oh, heads up, we detected this really scary thing in your community. Then people who are vaccinated already, take polio again as an example, maybe they're fully vaccinated, but they're like, uh-oh, maybe I'm not vaccinated enough, and they're the ones who go, and right, so we don't want to scare people. It's a balance, but I think what your point is spot on, that having that plan of what you do with the data is a really important step. Like, measuring it gets you only so far.
I'll just mention too, a lot of the discussion around wastewater is focusing on disease spread and preventing outbreaks. But the other benefit of wastewater surveillance is you can detect things that people normally wouldn't go to the doctor for, maybe, or wouldn't report. And things that maybe occur over a longer time period. So, you can detect things like sexually transmitted diseases. You can find evidence of foodborne illness, malnutrition. So those sorts of things may point to, like, maybe within a certain community, you need to do some social outreach, try to educate people to help prevent these sorts of things and lower those levels over time.
My life? Oh, yep. Okay. Thank you so much to our panelists. This has been very informative. If anybody would have told me early in my career that I'd be hosting a panel where we talked about if middle schoolers poop at school, then I probably wouldn't have believed them. Thank you.